I want to thank RAC for inviting me to give this talk. Thanks to Barbara for hosting the Zoom meeting and for Cliff for putting the thing together. My title is Regenerative Agriculture, Good for Soil and Water, Good for Farmers, and Good for Consumers. I'm David Harbour. I teach in the geology department. I'm a RAC board member. It's going to mostly be about soil and water because I'm an early scientist, but hope to talk a little bit about how some of these things benefit farmers and benefit us, the eaters and consumers. First, a caveat, I am a geologist and a gardener, not a farmer. So everything that I learned about these topics came from the experts in the county, including Tom Stanley and folks up at the Virginia Tech station in Rafine, and the farmers themselves, Mary and John Peterson at Verdant Acres, Steve Hart, the Hart Farm, Gabe Pent, there he is at Virginia Tech, my colleague Bill Hamilton, and then Glenn and Becky Sarzinski at Mountain Glen Farm. What is regenerative agriculture? There's so many terms out there to describe agriculture: organic, natural, permaculture, sustainable. They all differ slightly, but regenerative agriculture is a set of practices that focuses on soil health. Farmers that practice regenerative agriculture worry about growing soil, and then they get their product as a side benefit of growing their soil. And that's what the regenerate is in regenerative agriculture. The USDA defines soil health as the continued capacity of a soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. Too much soil has been thought of merely a substance into which you could put fertilizer and that supports the growth of the roots that support the plant. It is more than that. So why is regenerative agriculture important? David Montgomery, in his third book on soil, Growing a Revolution, says the degradation of soils and the loss of organic matter are the most underappreciated environmental crises humanity now faces. But the stage is set for ground-up transformational change as the short-term interests of farmers increasingly align with preserving long-term soil fertility. So what's good for the soil is going to be good for the farm communities, the farmers themselves. So before we get into regenerative agriculture, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about soil and soil development, so then we can talk about how to preserve those aspects. So a little bit of a diversion, I guess. Oh, sorry, I forgot a slide. So what's the nature and scale of this degradation that's been happening over the last couple of hundred years? Probably the biggest one is soil erosion. This is Gabe Pent, who directs the Shenandoah Valley Agricultural Research and Extension Center up in Rafine, the McCormick Farm, we mostly know it as. And if you walk out into the fields, you can see characteristics of the limestone outcrops that say to me, the geologist, that this soil or this outcrop was under soil recently, and that those marks, those sort of rills on the outcrop, say that we've lost a foot and a half of soil from these former wheat fields during the time of plowing. And with that soil erosion, we lose organic matter. We lose fertility, we lose the resilience of the soil to be able to withstand drought, to be able to withstand good years and bad years, pests and other impacts. So soil erosion is the big thing, but losing fertility is possible from plowing and other kinds of things. So this degradation is loss of function and loss of material in the soil scape. But first, soils and soil formation, as I said before. So the Soil Science Society of America defines it in a biological and chemical way and as a functional matter. And geologists like to think about it as the stuff that breaks down from the material underneath. So there's a sort of a long-term view and a short-term view, or a functional view, or an evolutionary view. And they're both important because the geologists understand how important soil erosion is today, as well as the creation of soils, and the soil science background is important for function. I like to think of soils as the gatekeeper in our hydrologic cycle. If you think about rain on a lush soil that's full of life and has lots of organic matter, that rainwater is absorbed and can be used by the vegetation and the biota later. But rain on a parking lot or a compacted soil doesn't stand a chance. It's going straight off the watershed and taking with it the resilience that you have in the landscapes. And so the soils are the gatekeeper of infiltration, whether or not we can put water in the soil. Soils form and create horizons at the soil surface. So in an agricultural sense, I'm sure most of you have heard of topsoil. Geologists and soil pedologists call that the A plus maybe the O horizon, the leaf litter at the top, and maybe some others. And then below those are the subsoil, or the rock or unweathered material below. And it's that topsoil that we're trying to preserve. The lower horizons are not something you want to be farming in, but we often are these days because we've lost the topsoil. So how do you define a good soil? There's lots of criteria. Of course, you can imagine that soil scientists and geologists go crazy with all this kind of stuff. We study all kinds of things, but the physical character is important, which includes the water retention. The chemical characteristics of a soil are important for plant fertility, plant health, and nutrient concentration. And then also, in some cases, salts can accumulate and be problematic. But a soil is also biological, and that's the thing I probably know the least about, and you shouldn't let me talk to you too much about that. So soil horizons, perhaps you've all seen something like this. This is on the foot of a sandstone ridge here in Western Virginia. We have a darker horizon at the surface and a whiter horizon here in the middle, and then this red horizon. Has anybody driven around Rockbridge County and seen a red soil that has crops in it? Sure you have, and that's because we've lost the upper horizon, and these are that's what we have left. So our fertility is gone in the last 100 years, and we're farming in the subsoil. Soils have different textures. So are they clayey? Are they sandy? Are they silty? The best soils are right here in the middle, and the surface soils, the top soils, are often the best. And this stuff down in here is full of clay often, and doesn't work out so well in terms of farming and water retention. Soil structure is the development of aggregates, and it promotes the movement of water in a soil. And so over time, soils develop this aggregate structure with the aid of soil biology and the gluing together of soil particles with the biological cement. And we need that soil structure to move water through a soil and to promote lively habitats for soil biology. The measure of, I guess, the physical properties is generating the organic matter in the soil known as humus. And there's a lot of discussion about what humus really is and how it's produced and what its end result is, and is it permanent or not, or can it be degraded? But it's a cascade of biological and chemical processes that create organic acids that often get adsorbed onto surfaces of mineral grains or oxide grains in the soil. And the Humus is responsible for holding water. It's the home for the soil biology. They develop their own sites and frameworks for some of those sites. It's where nutrients are stored and minerals are stored on the edges of the organic molecules. And importantly, it sequesters carbon as it gets thicker. And so many of you are familiar with the thick prairie soils that we have here where I am in the Midwest, that over tens of thousands of years have sequestered carbon as they have thickened and developed. We didn't luck out so much in Virginia, but out here, that's a different story. So the development of soils is a chemical and physical process, but it really is a function of the soil biology. And I'm going to provide you with some links here at the bottom, but these are microscopic images. And the soil biology starts off from the very smallest organisms, the bacteria, and perhaps even the viruses, and works its way up into visible organisms that we associate with soil, like the earthworms and other larger arthropods. The soil is really a food web. It's a series of interactions between the lowest trophic levels, the plants. Okay, they photosynthesize and create the sugars that feed this organism from the surface or from the ground down below. So they absorb sunlight for us and turn it into carbohydrates that then feed the rest of the food system. And it's the action of that food web that creates the physical and hydrologic character of the soil that we depend on for life. They do things like they mix the soil. Arthropods and earthworms do that. When they break down soil carbohydrates, they can create a glue known as glomalin, I believe, or glomalin, that helps build soil aggregates, which is part of what helps soil hydrology develop the infiltration that can soak up our rainfalls. And the production of humus and storing the carbon. Plants are known to trade sugar for the nutrients they need. So for example, fungi can find phosphorus in the subjacent rock and trade it for sugar, and the plant can develop a relationship with the soil biology to feed itself. There are bacteria that invade the roots of plants, and then the plants can help the bacteria reproduce and spit out the next few generations and help inoculate its own soil around it. So there's a constant traffic of information and material between the roots and the soil around it. So here's some examples of the soil biology. These are images of the soil, and these are earthworm pathways that have been illuminated by dyes. Earthworms go to the surface and pull plants down into their burrows and shred the plants and move the soil around and provide root channels for roots and also pathways for water. Okay. There is an incredible, at 46 minutes in the link here, an earthworm goes out and pulls in a leaf and just sucks it down its burrow. It's pretty impressive. You'll like it. Other examples of larger organisms you might see are arthropods that are, they're hunting smaller organisms in the soil. They live in the cracks between the soil particles. And the fungi are, of course, very important. They help make the aggregates. They help build the structure by providing habitat for other organisms. They live symbiotically with bacteria. And there's an exchange between the the roots of plants and the fungi community of nutrients and information. So what kind of soils do we have in Rockbridge County? There's 14 or 16 soil orders, and the two most common soils are actually, one is a soil that we find mostly in the prairies. These are thicker prairie soils, but we find these kinds of soils on our floodplains. And so, as you know, most of the row crops that happen here in Rockbridge County, or there in Rockbridge County, the best place for that is down on the sandier, siltier floodplains. And the soils of the Great Plains developed by the constant rain of what are known as phytoliths, which are silica particles that a grass develops on its leaf to help prevent grazing, but grazing animals develop the ability to regrow their teeth as a way to, combat this defense that grasses came up with. And so the grazing and the production of these phytoliths is added to the soil mass in the Great Plains over time. It's an interesting symbiosis. Unfortunately, that's a pretty small percentage of our county. Some of the uplands and a few of the areas along our rivers and creeks. Most of our soils in Rockbridge, whoops, I whacked the name off of here, but these are ultisols, and they are weathered to the point where the subsoil is infertile. So much water has passed through that subsoil in conditions that are fairly hot that we've leached most of the things that we need for fertility out of that soil. So they're intensely weathered. They have a thin, fragile topsoil. And once you remove it, you don't have much left but this clay, iron oxide gook that's hard to farm in. So,
David?
Am I coming through?
Yes, David,
Yeah,
there is a question from Bob who asks, back a couple slides, are the earthworms you showed native earthworms or the larger ones from Europe?
I believe those were, I'd have to go look at it, but I believe those were native earthworms. Yes, I know there is a problem with non-native earthworms. They can denude the forest floor and do all kinds of other things. So, and they can be an invasive species as well. Other questions while we're at it?
Not yet.
Okay. So once we have this fantastic resource, how do we keep it in place, or what is it that we are doing that caused us to lose this resource? This is a photo from somewhere in Rockbridge County taken by my students. We have two simultaneous things going on. We have a riparian buffer down at the bottom with some tree planting in it to protect the stream, but in the upland we have grazing to the point that we're exposing the subsoil between the grass blades, although this is a picture in the winter when it is not very green out on the soil. So soil erosion is a big deal. How many of you heard the story that we only have 60 years of farming left if we keep degrading soils at the rate we're doing it now? And that's a global estimate. I think that has been called into question, but it was alarming, and it might say that humanity depends on something that's leaving quickly. If you look at the carbon that we've added to the atmosphere, 1/5 of it is originated in the soil. So we can think about smokestacks, we can think about big trucks or cars, we can think about under insulated homes, but 1/5 of it came from the oxidized organic matter in soils that have either been exposed or eroded out into the water network. And it continues to be 1/6 of our carbon emissions. So it's a big deal. So the contribution of soil degradation and soil erosion is making it harder to be a farmer in the time of climate change. So the problem with soil degradation is it's a positive feedback loop. Degradation produces more degradation. If you expose the soil or till it, you break down the aggregates, which reduces infiltration. You get a surface crust, there's more erosion, you lose more organic matter, there's less aggregates, and so and so and so and so, and you drop down this curve until you don't have any soil left. And we know this from the Amazon, where they clear an area and they can farm it for a year or two, but that soil is even more fragile. And so after a couple of years, they have to move on because they have completely removed the nutrient capabilities of the soil.
We have a question, David.
Okay.
Patricia asks, would the soil in my area near Middlebrook on the Stanton side have that same soil condition?
Middlebrook has mostly alpha sols and ultisols up there. Yeah, so the thicker soils are in the hollows and the floodplains, but the uplands have mostly ultisols or alpha sols. Yeah. Middlebrook has great soils. It's not quite as steep up there. Okay, what is the source of this soil erosion? How did we do this as a society? First of all, we cleared the land. If you come here in the 1880s, you would have seen farms going right up to the tip top of House Mountain. There were areas that were cleared for corn. There were hogs grazing, and most of the trees were gone. And so we had lost the holding power of roots, and we plowed up the land. Soil erosion followed the plow, and that's happened for many societies throughout history for thousands of years. Soil plowing or disturbance is important because it disrupts the connections with the fungal mycelia, with the surrounding territory. It leads to compaction. It dries out the soil and allows the soil to oxidize the organic matter. And because of the lack of infiltration, after you plow, the soil seals the surface during a rainstorm because of the splashing, and it promotes runoff, which then, of course, begets more erosion. So that runoff, which normally would have soaked into the ground, causes the removal of the topsoil, and you get rills, which are temporary, or gullies that are permanent. And the picture on the bottom left is from Providence Canyon in Georgia, I think, where agricultural practices caused so much erosion it produced what they call the Little Grand Canyon, or the Eastern Grand Canyon, where the gullies irreversibly eroded the soil and there's nothing left but weathered bedrock. So everybody knows about the Dust Bowl. So if you expose the soil from plowing, you have wind erosion. That happens in Rockbridge County, not to the degree, but we have some problems with grazing, overgrazing. I've taken students to Iceland, and Iceland used to have fertile soils from the sea up to the top of the mountains, and there was so much sheep grazing that the soil, it's almost a Martian landscape in many places. So here on the bottom left, you can see little, the Icelanders call it roofabord, these little mesas of soil where it's been completely stripped away due to overgrazing. So in the 1930s, we recognized that we needed to preserve this resource, and we passed the Soil Conservation Act and developed what we knew then as the Soil Conservation Service. Now it's the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And we know what to do. We know how to conserve soil. We can keep it on the ground. We can put the fence rows back for the wind. We can plow along the contour to quit the rilling. There's strip cropping where you alternate grass and crops. You can put grass waterways on to prevent the gullies. And primarily, we've preserved soil by no-till. We've gotten rid of the plow. And that's an important thing. And I think in places most places where soil conservation practices are being adopted, we're now not eroding soil at a greater than the rate at which it's produced geologically. So we are once again building up soils due to these conservation practices. So regenerative agriculture fits under this idea of soil conservation, because what we are trying to do with regenerative agriculture, not we, farmers are trying to do with regenerative agriculture, is to build soil health and promote that lively ecology for the soil. It has some principles. The top three are agreed on by most everybody. Others would add more kinds of conditions at the bottom, but first of all, minimizing the disturbance of the soil. So if we use no-till practices, or we minimize the amount of driving across the soil, then we can facilitate the growth of soil structure into aggregates, and we can facilitate the development of soil permeability. Keeping the soil covered keeps it cooler, keeps it wetter, and leaving mulch, or putting out mulch, or leaving crop stubble, or even using cover crops are important to do that. Rotating crops and animals promotes the diversity of the soil biology and increases the number of organisms that you can support in the soil. Many people add that not only do you need to keep the soil covered, but there should be something living in the soil at all times. And so maintaining living roots is important to keep feeding the soil, even between crops or as you move animals from one practice to another. So let me give you some examples of some of these. Here's the old USDA logo with the plow in it. It's different now. No plow in it anymore, because the USDA actively promotes no-till farming. This is an advertisement from No-Till November in 2018. I forget what state that was from. And it says, save time, money, and build your soil health by adopting no-till farming. And so the idea is fewer passes with the tractor, saves you money, you have more fertility, you're going to lose less of your nutrients in the off season, so maybe you save some money. You can plant legumes and cover crops, all kinds of things. So a couple examples at the bottom: runoff from a no-till farm versus a tilled farm in Iowa, showing the hydrologic response of those two practices. We're doing that here in Rockbridge. There are plenty of people who are raising grains, mostly for feed for cattle. They are not tilling the soil, so if you drive around, you won't find a bare plowed soil as much as you might have. And here we're contour plowing as well. These are photos collected by some of the students in my regenerative agriculture class last year. People are leaving their plant residues out in the field. This is from where I am right now. It helps keep the soil cool. And that, wouldn't you all love to have some of this black soil there in Rockbridge County? Oh my goodness, you put your hand into it and it's like squeezing a chocolate cake. It's yummy stuff up here. Never seen a soil like that in Virginia. So cover crops is an important part of this, especially for, and this is talking about the row cropping, which is not so common in Rockbridge County, but it's recommended by most of the organizations and institutions studying soil health. And it improves yields and improves soil health. And usually the yields come from the addition of extra nutrients by the cover crop, for example, planting legumes or peas or something in a crop that needs to have that extra shot of nitrogen. The legumes can generate the nitrogen in the off season. This is a dairy in the southern end of the county, and they're putting out cover crops between their corn plantings for the dairy cattle. This is I think they're putting in some grass here in between seasons. So I think these are drilled in. That field might be plowed, but notice the steep topography. It's important to keep this soil covered during the rainstorms. And lastly, rotation. Rotation is important to building resilience to pests, and it builds fertility by providing nutrients that the crop that came in between might have harvested or might have removed. And so I've heard it said that if you go 5 to 6 years between the same plant in an area, that you can pretty much keep pests out of your fields, but you have to wait that long. So, but at least some farmers in the Midwest are now not just planting corn or soybeans, but they're rotating with things like rye and some other legumes to deal with some of the fertility and some of the pest issues that are developing in the Midwest. Crop rotation is common in Rockbridge. This is a dairy farm along Carrs Creek, and they use soybeans and corn, and they have grass fallow seasons in between, or fallow strips in between the corn that they use for their dairy, or the grains that they use for their dairy. I've been working with Verdant Acres up in Rafine, Virginia, just south of Middlebrook, and they practice rotation with their animals. So in this image, you see sheep and a few goats in a pasture that is about 150 feet by 150 feet. And then there are some areas where the pasture is resting, and then after that come the chickens. And the thinking about this is that the grazing animals eat the grass, they poop out the manure, and then you let the manure set for 3, 4 days, 5 days, and then you put the chickens out, and the chickens will dig through the manure and eat all the parasites and other diseases or disease organisms that might infect the sheep the next time around. And so that's a sort of one-two punch, and then they deliver their nitrogen fertilizer back to the field. And so animal rotation, just like crop rotation, is good for pest management and fertility management. This is John Peterson at Verdant Acres, and he's going to talk a little bit about his rotation, and you're going to see that from the air. Dave Pfaff from our IQ centers has a drone video of his moving the sheep from one pasture or one little enclosure to another.
Every give or take 12 hours. This time of the day is great too, because the grass has had all day to absorb sunlight and build up its sugars before sending them down to the roots. So usually around 3, 4 o'clock in the spring, the grass is going to have the most potential and nutrients for the sheep. So we try to catch one in the late afternoon after the sun has been feeding the grass all day, and then sometimes we'll do a morning move also.
So I really want to give a shout out to the farmers that I have worked with. They know so much about their soil and about their animals and what they can do to improve their the soil on their farms. And so they're a terrific resource, and I've really enjoyed getting to know what they do. Another farmer I've worked with is Steve Hart at the Hart Farm, or Heartburn Farm, I think he calls it, out Carrs Creek way. This is from the new flock of satellites from the Planet Corporation that are imaging the ground about 1 or 2, 3 or 4 times a week. They're heading for once a day. And what we're going to see, he's got about 80 acres here in his upland, and we're going to start off in February, and we're going to go through the spring green up, and you should be able to see how as he moves the pastures, they get eaten, but then they green up very quickly behind after the the pasture is allowed to grow. And he just moves the fence along these corridors, and you should be able to watch the grazing happen and then the green follow in behind it. So let me see if we can get this going. So the animals start down in this corner or over here, and then they're going to move towards the northwest. And you should start to see the green following in behind the pastures as we get in towards the middle of June. So there's the grazing, but everything's already green behind it as he moves it along. So that sort of rotation allows the plants to regrow their roots. They've been stimulated by the grazing. We can maximize the biomass above ground and below ground and produce those healthy soils. A program that Virginia Tech at the agricultural farm is trying to get going is something they call the Graze 300 for Virginia, a goal of trying to have enough grass on the ground that you can graze for 300 days out of 365 and only have to feed grass to your animals for a couple of months. And so they call it summer stockpiling, rotating your cattle in enclosures such that you can save some of the summer high production grass for later on. And instead of having to go through the expense and time of cutting and baling and then delivering hay to your cows, you let the cows walk into the field where you've stockpiled the hay. It saves money in that way, in insurance policy. So good for farmers. So what are some of the benefits of regenerative agriculture, of these practices? We get increased resilience against drought and pests. So by building the soil biology, by building the soil physical and chemical characteristics, we're able to store rainfall and support the soil biology. The more diverse biology means that then as pests come in, there are more predators there that are ready to eat the pests. And so a more healthy ecosystem in the soil is one that's less toxic for the plants that you're trying to put out or the animals. The increased fertility is coming largely through better soil biological function, but we can also retain the nutrients instead of losing them to soil erosion or to the washing of materials out of the soil into the groundwater. And those things are best facilitated by not having the erosion. Something that I don't know as much about, but hope to gain that knowledge, but something I've read certainly in a lot of publications, is that the farmers who practice regenerative agriculture have a greater margin per acre. So they get a premium for their products, maybe something like grass-fed or organic. Maybe it comes from the fact that they're making fewer passes with a tractor, so they're saving on diesel or wear and tear on their equipment. And they generally can reduce the herbicide and fertilizer inputs. So they have marginally better or similar yields per acre, but because they're spending less per acre, they have a greater profit. And so in a time when we aren't paying farmers very much per acre, that has a real draw for that. And lastly, of course, there's the drawdown of greenhouse gases. If we build our soils and build the humus, we are going to be trapping carbon in the soils. So maybe we can pay farmers to do that. So 1.5 degrees is what they predict for 2055, and that's going to be bad. So the UN report says that's not so good. You mean grazing, and we can eat meat and save the planet by eating grass-fed beef? You're kidding, right? No, it's true. So this is an organization known as the Carbon Cowboys. It's farmers and pencil-headed academics like me and other people And they think we can store a lot of carbon in the soil. If we look at the amount of soil that is produced in the atmosphere, if we could store some of that in the soil, we'd be better off. Big Ag is catching on to this. Consumers would like to eat food produced in a way that doesn't pollute the Mississippi, doesn't cause groundwater, isn't using glyphosate and all those kinds of things. And Big Ag realizes, oh, they'll spend money to do that. And so bigger companies are actually starting to hook up with regenerative agriculture techniques and trying to promote that out to their farming communities. So it may be in a Kroger near you someday soon. And you've all heard of grass-fed beef. There are certainly lots of studies that say that grass-fed beef is healthier than grain-fed beef. And so there's a benefit there for consumers. Can we pay farmers to do this work for us? Indigo Ag and Nori are two companies that are already doing it. So farmers that practice regenerative agriculture are being paid based on various estimates to store carbon in the soil at a rate determined by the market. And some of us locally are working to try to set up a carbon sequestration fund to make solar panels, to plant trees, and hopefully, if I can get my act together, pay farmers for storing soil and the carbon. So next time you go on a plane fight, you can offset your carbon with our local carbon credit fund. Perhaps. So what have I been up to? The last few years, we've started investigating soil carbon in order to say how much carbon can we store in our fields here in Rockbridge. I've been primarily working with grazers, so and not with row crops. We've learned how to sample in the field, which figuring out how much carbon is on a farm is an interesting task. The students and I have developed some procedures so we can take some samples and bring them home to analyze them. The students this is verdant acres here. They've sampled based on topography and soils to see if they can differentiate the carbon in different settings or in different soil types. So here's like the floodplain and the upland. Another student was trying to figure out, well, can we detect a difference in carbon between a regenerative practice and a continuous stocking practice? We have other kinds of sampling procedures. So we're trying to figure out what it is we need to measure and how we can do it. Measuring carbon, I'll tell you, is just a pain. First of all, you got to process a lot of samples and jam them into machines. You can either burn it and analyze it with chromatography, or you can burn it and just measure it by weight loss. But there's a lot of assumptions that go into it. And I didn't get into this and late in my career to learn to be a chemist, but oh well, I guess I am. We're doing a lot of work with remote sensing to help farmers see if they can see what they're doing from the air. We're using drones and satellite imagery, looking at soil health and soil moisture. So my student Ryan took these shots with a drone. One of them uses infrared light, where the red color is actually infrared, which records this spike in infrared reflectance that you get from grasslands. And so we can see the grazed field versus the ungrazed field very clearly here in this infrared image. And you can make a productivity map, much like we make productivity maps for the whole world. I think you can see how this changes over the seasons, the respiring earth going back and forth. So we can do that same kind of thing here in Rockbridge County and develop a productivity index for a soil and link that to the soil carbon and check that over time and over seasons. So lots of interesting work. Lately, we've been thinking about how deep you got to go. Most of our studies go to 30 centimeters or less. about a foot. Here's a corn plant down to 7 feet. What's going on here? So there's a lot of question among academics about where we have to measure carbon if we want to figure out the total carbon storage. And lastly, I'm a nerd. I'm a scientist, and I study the process of carbon. Like global climate change is probably not a scientific question anymore. This is an economic and political or social issue. We have the potential to offset our carbon, a lot of our anthropogenic carbon, with soil carbon sequestration, but can we do it economically, and certainly can we do it politically and socially achievable is a question. So hopefully we'll get there. So that's what I have for you tonight. If you have a question, I'll be happy to answer it. Hopefully this is what I said.
Hey, David, can I just say my question instead of write it?
Oh, yes.
Sure.
Regarding grazing animals and their ability to rebuild the soil and therefore that process capturing carbon, is there a tipping point though where if there are some, if it's good to a point, but then if there are that many more grazing animals, the resulting carbon emissions from that, am I making sense? This is why I want to say it instead of write it, because I don't know, I'm sure you understand what I'm trying to.
There are a lot of questions about grazing animals. And when we look at what are known as the life cycle costs, the biggest gain is to get them off the feed. So the corn and soybeans they eat, because they're not genetically programmed to eat grain. They're supposed to eat grass. So that's a lot of the carbon footprint for beef comes from the corn and soybeans, that the way in which they're grown, and then what it does to the digestive nature of the animal. So certainly there's the inventory of grass-fed animals has been studied, and that is better for the carbon cycle. But you're right, if you put too many animals on and you erode the soil, it's not going to do you any good. The way John and Steve Hart and Becky Sarsinski are grazing their animals helps build the soil. And so it is a net carbon loss, even though it's beef. And we sort of think we can't eat meat and have society, but we have to eat less probably, but we can still eat meat and it improves soil health.
In a perfect world in Rockbridge County, how many cows per acre how many cows can an acre support, and do this rotation if in an ideal world?
In Rockbridge County, I'm not sure. The only thing that I've read about stocking rates that I've seen are from the Midwest, where you can see they stock them at rates. I think it was 100,000 pounds per acre at that density, but you have to be rotating them. So I can't answer that question. Maybe Tom Stanley, do you know the answer to that question?
Yeah, well, thank you, David. Yeah, I appreciate the chance to jump in. I don't want to preempt folks that have taken time to type in questions. But first, I appreciate the chance to jump in, and also really, you super job, David. It's just a really informative presentation. And I would echo what was shared. And I would encourage, for those who want to learn more, a place that I've gone to look is the Beef Lamb New Zealand site. New Zealand's really been progressive at looking at this question. What's the right stocking rate? What's the, how do you balance carbon? Because New Zealand's a big exporter of meat, and they know that if they're going to competitively position their product in other countries, they've got to show that they can be carbon neutral. And so but the essential question is in terms of, what's the right number of animals? It's a tough one, and there's a bunch of variables.
Yeah, there we have to rely on what the practitioner can see in his or her field on a daily basis when they go out and they look at it, and they are constantly adjusting, I think, for patterns of precipitation or temperature and what their animals are like. And so I think it's it would be hard to put a really hard number on it easily.
But I think the short answer though, I think is probably lies in, and overall is probably over time as a general reduction in stocking rates. And if we can have our farm systems where farmers are rewarded for the carbon they capture, then they're going to voluntarily do that. The other thing, it looks like what you watch what they're doing in New Zealand, the carbon in the soil, while it can hold a lot of carbon, it can also lose that carbon really quickly. And
especially
so in our
as temperature rises.
There you go. And that
respiration rates increase as global temperature increases. So
the trees in those systems, I think we're seeing more, and that people look at these systems, looking at incorporating trees in these grazing systems, because the trees have a real role to play here in terms of capturing carbon and doing it in a way that is less transitory, that they capture and hold that carbon. So
thanks for bringing that up, Tom. I should have had agroforestry as one of my things, because that's something that does need promoting in our grazing lands here, because I think we can have nut crops, we can have woods. There are other things that farmers can use to get soak every dollar they can out of their acres. Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question about grass-fed beef versus grass-fed and grass-finished. Don't a lot of our animals end up in a feedlot somewhere?
Yeah, grain finished, you mean, versus grass-fed? Yeah, grass-fed is usually grass right to the end. Grain finished is sort of the standard for most of our grazing systems right now, I think.
Well, I understand that grass-fed, as it's marketed though, often is actually grass-fed for most of its life, and then grass-finished. I mean,
grain finished, you mean?
Grain finished.
Yeah, that could be. I don't think the term grass-fed is regulated by any entity. Right. So it's a sort of I think it's a good idea to see your animal before you eat it. So I've been eating cows and pigs and sheep that I have known personally, or that my daughter has slaughtered. So, it's that's a healthier way to do it.
Well, I discovered this thinking bison would be a good bet, because they're out on the prairie eating grass, right? Turns out, from what I've been able to find out, most bison that's marketed commercially is actually grain finished, because that's the taste and the taste and the fattiness that people expect. It happens that Walmart sells grass-fed and grass-finished bison. So I found that kind of interesting. The other question I had was about methane, which is another problem with raising animals. So how does that figure into the equation?
In lots of ways. There's lots of studies about the methane balance and whether we're increasing methane. Should we eat soybeans or should we eat a cow? But I think the methane balance is better with grazed meat than it is with kept meat. But then there are also lots of practices we can do to do methane capture for things like dairy farms where they're bringing animals into a zone. We can actually capture methane, and that's being practiced, and pay farmers for methane capture. So I think the methane release from grass or grazed animals is maybe a wash, but I'd have to dig into that literature more.
This has been fascinating. Thank you, David.
Thank you,
David.
For
My name is Mike Smith. I have some information that I would like to share with you and other people in the audience. I actually receive information from an organization called Farmers Footprint. And this is a national organization that's been started by Zach Bush.
Mhm.
He's an MD in Charlottesville, interested in gut health in relationship to soil health.
Correct.
And I get their emails periodically, and I just received their most recent email a couple days ago. And they were talking about a white paper that was released from the Friday, I guess, by the Rodale Institute, who has been looking at data on soil carbon sequestration potential over the last 10 years. And they have concluded with this study that a global switch to regenerative crop and pasture systems could draw down more than 100% of annual CO2 emissions. So I think this has a lot of, shows the potential of regenerative agriculture and, helping to mitigate climate change. And as you said earlier, this is perhaps more a political choice than a scientific one, but it looks like, and of course this will be heavily scrutinized, but it looks like the potential is there if we can convert agriculture across the country to regenerative agriculture, that we could actually sequester all the CO2 that we're currently producing.
Yeah, I think if we can do it in a way where farmers can make more money and spend less time doing what they're doing, and we can eat healthier food and improve our own gut bacteria biota, as you say, people should check out Zach Bush's ideas. It's my wife's fully on board. She's a family practice doctor. She's fully on board with that idea. So thanks for bringing that up, Mike. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that I know of a farmer in New Zealand who feeds his cattle charcoal to become biochar. And one of the benefits of that practice is that it holds down the methane.
Ah, perfect.
And so it charges by raw charcoal to be biochar needs to be activated or to be colonized by the life. And so that's being done in the gut of the cow. And then when it comes out, there's a second cycle of animals, which is the dung beetle, that will go into the ground and deliver that carbon. Now the charcoal is recalcitrant, so therefore it's not biologically available, but it holds, the beauty of it is it holds all the microbes and the other nutrients. So that's the benefit, but also the recalcitrant carbon is a drawdown from the atmosphere. So and there is a world movement. I watched a program this morning. My internet wasn't working real good, but was from Nigeria. Well, actually, they were all over the world, but it was led by primarily Africans, and talking about how they were going to make a income path for regenerative practices, specifically carbon or environmental services. Because I really believe that the tension we have with farmers is unfortunate, because really they have a huge potential for contributing to the solution. And so I sure hope we can nurture that recognition.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for bringing up biochar. That biochar has a high potential for sequestering carbon. It's a rare practice currently, but it certainly is something that could be done with our woody debris. It has a lot of concert with biomass and other kinds of things. So thanks for bringing up biochar.
Let me just say one thing. I am getting set to do my second batch of flame cap, and I'm not going to get into what that is, but in any case, I would welcome people to come spend time here when I do that, and show people how they can make charcoal and try to build soil from it.
Great, thanks. Other questions? Well, thank you all for attending. I appreciate it.
Thank you, David.
Have a good evening.
Cliff, would you like to say something before we adjourn?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I want to thank David for that just fabulous talk and presentation on a very complex topic, but a significant one. And you made it so understandable, David. Real clarity in the way you presented this very, very complicated issue. I want to thank Barbara for her fabulous technical work here. And I'd like to let folks know that we have a speaker for November next month on our Wednesdays at 7, Zoom. And the topic is going to be what's in your water, the impact of chemical pollution. So it sort of ties in a bit to what we were discussing tonight. And Joe DiNardo will be speaking then. And one thing that was brought out, I would say, with all these questions, were great questions tonight and encouraged great discussion. The last point on the international aspect, I always like to sort of, what do they say, think global and act local. If you Google regenerationinternational.org, regenerationinternational.org, you'll see kind of what it says, a global, various people from around the world and organizations from around the world focusing on regenerative agriculture, as David was discussing. Well, thanks for everyone for attending, and look forward for everyone to come back next month.
All right.
Thank you, David.
Everybody.
Thank you, David.
Good to see everybody.
Thanks, Barbara.
Super job, David. That was really good.